Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Monday, July 20th, and certainly a lot going on that we have to talk about. Unfortunately, what dominates the news and probably the political landscape still in the last 10 days or 11 days of July is the Iran war, which President Trump, of course, has informed us the United States won somewhere around March 1st or 2nd, although they still seem to feel the need to keep bombing Iran. In fact, the memorandum of understanding that was signed in mid-June, I think we can all just agree is, for all intents and purposes, torn up. And over the weekend, I think an important point was crossed. I don't want to say the Rubicon and be very overly dramatic, but the United States hit a desalination plant in Iran as part of an escalation to move on to civilian infrastructure, which is the desalination plant power stations, as opposed to military targets. This is where Trump has decided to go, and the Iranians, as they've been promising to do, have responded tit for tat, as we keep hearing in the news. So they hit two desalination plants in two different countries, one in Bahrain and the other in, was it Kuwait? Yeah, I believe it was Kuwait. And they hit one of them twice. I can't remember which one. So the reason that this is very concerning is that this represents an escalation not so much in scale as in kind. In other words, both sides have avoided civilian infrastructure up until now. In fact, the Iranians have exclusively hit U.S. military bases. One of the things that's frustrating for me about the mainstream media, legacy media, and I have to peek at it because I try not to watch it. I feel like I get dumber every time I watch a clip from one of the nightly news programs or read something on CNN's website. But one of the things that's frustrating is they keep saying Iran hit these countries as if they're bombing major cities. And that's not what's happening. They're hitting U.S. military bases in those countries. And it's a little unclear. I don't think that the military bases, they may depend on those desalination plants in the countries where Iran hit them. But just to give a big picture here, one of the things about this war is, and the reason that so many people advised Trump and previous presidents not to start it, is the amount of leverage that Iran has versus the amount of leverage, even the U.S. military could have using military power. So there's no question that the United States military is orders of magnitude more powerful than Iran's. Nobody is disputing that. The problem with the American government and the American public is they don't seem to understand that there are limits to what even the most powerful military in the world can do. And here's just an example. So the United States bombed one Iranian desalination plant, and as far as the media that we have is concerned, as far as it can be trusted, it seems like they put that plant out of operation. Okay. And then Iran hit two different, they hit two different desalination plants, one of them twice, and it's unclear, say the U.S. media, whether or not those are out of operation. Now, let's just say they are, because one thing we found is that all of the damage that Iran has done in retaliation for U.S. attacks has been understated. And of course, the damage that the U.S. military has done has been overstated. That we've heard how many times that their military capabilities are 80% destroyed or whatever, and they just keep responding. So let's just say they were destroyed. One thing I'd like to do is put some perspective on that. Now, first of all, the big picture is that the 6 Gulf states rely for well over 90% of their drinking water on these desalination plants. Okay. So if you were to take those out, you would have a humanitarian disaster on your hands of epic proportions, where Iran only depends upon desalinated water for 5%. Okay. So again, here's another point where Iran has the leverage, even though the US is far more powerful on this particular issue, tit for tat, let's start hitting desalination plants. The Iran can do a lot more damage to the Gulf states. And I would imagine that, the US military bases are depending on local water there. So also to our soldiers there, to wherever they are. I don't know if they're on the bases or still in hotels, whatever. So Iran has the leverage there. It's just like the Strait. Again, the US Navy against the Iranian Navy head to head is no contest. Air Force, whatever. Ground troops might be a different story just because of the amount of ground troops Iran can bring to the battlefield. And the home country, the defending country, always has a huge advantage. When you're the invading country, it's much harder for you to win a decisive victory on the battlefield than it is if you're defending your own land. But anyway, the US military, far more powerful in the air, far more powerful on the sea. But Iran does not have to be as powerful as the US Navy or Air Force in order to effectively close the strait. They've shown us that. So even after all of this infrastructure, military infrastructure has been wiped out by the US Air Force, what Iran has left, and I think what they have left is far more significant than we're being told. I've seen, dissenting reports saying they've got about 80% of their capabilities left because so much of it was underground. But whatever that is, 50%, 80%, 30%, they don't need much to make it impossible for commercial shipping to use the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, one rocket hits one ship, and that's it. It shuts the lights off. Nobody wants to insure the ships. That's why you heard Trump talking about the government insuring them early on. And the ships they don't want to risk their actual, $500 billion, whatever equipment. So that's what I'm saying about leverage, is that Iran has that. All they need to do is cut off, a significant portion of the oil supply. Now, some is still getting out. All right. So I recently saw Mearsheimer again, and he's just a great, just kind of by the facts, and he reads the mainstream media the same way I do, and kind of says, okay, well, what out of this can I pin down as a data point that's probably accurate, and how much of this is evasion, spin? Do I have to read between the lines? But in any case, he estimated that about a third of to back up, about 20% of the world's oil before the war was flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians shut it down early in the war, and almost none was getting out. And since then, there have been workarounds. There have been new pipelines opened. There have been overland routes by the Iranians and the other side to try and mitigate that. And he estimated about a third of that 20% was now getting out some other way. And one of the ways that it can get out is through the Red Sea. I'm going to bring up a map of the Middle East here. And I'm not sure if a lot of people are familiar with just sometimes a picture says 1,000 words, right? So let me share this with you. Okay, so you should be looking at a map of the Middle East. My cursor is swirling around the word Iraq right now. Okay, and what we've all become very familiar with is this area over here, the Strait of Hormuz. And you can see it's got this crazy sharp angle path that's surrounded on three sides by Iran's shores. Although it's not like the old days where, okay, there's forts along the shore and they're bombing the ships. All right, rockets are coming from sites all over Iran, or at least all over that part of Iran, and from underground, whatever, to be able to, keep ships from trying to travel through there. And the few that have tried to defy their authority there have been hit and damaged. As far as I know, no ship's been sunk, but they get hit and they turn back. So at the end of the day, they're still vastly interrupting oil exports through that waterway. And, the United States has been tamping down the price of oil by going through its oil reserves and the strategic petroleum reserve. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But so right here, you have part of the problem. And then out here somewhere, far enough away from Iran where they can't be hit by Iran's missiles and drones, is our new U.S. Navy ships who are also blockading. So Iran's blockading anyone friendly to the U.S. The U.S. is supposedly also blockading and Iran's oil exports. And well, I think that's basically it because no one else there is friendly to them except Iraq, which wasn't friendly to Iran until we got rid of their Sunni leader and put the Shiites in charge, in another stroke of genius by our elites. And you can see why this is, like I said, a picture says 1,000 words. Here's Syria, Shiite. Here's Iran. We used to have this. Now, Iraq is a Shiite majority, but there was a Sunni government in charge with Saddam Hussein. And of course, the United States funded Saddam Hussein and provided him indirectly chemical weapons to use against the Iranians all through the 80s. So one more reason, this whole idea that Iran's been at war with the United States for 47 years is bass-ackwards. It's been the other way around since really 1953, when the United States first overthrew the Iranian government. But getting back to the logistics here, so you've got the strait. All right, so you see how that's a problem. Well, here's the other problem. Where else could Saudi Arabia? Now, most of Saudi Arabia's oil exports are on the Persian Gulf coast. So that's where they've been sending most of their oil. But of course, they could come over to the Red Sea coast, right? And they do have some export capabilities here, and they could try to shift more of that exports to the Red Sea. Well, what does Iran just asked their buddies in Yemen, the Houthis, to do? Look what we have at the bottom of the Red Sea. It's another narrow strait. It's not quite as bad as this deal here with you have to go up and around that peninsula, but it's very narrow. And to some extent, the Houthis have the ability to shut down that opening as well. And since the strikes on these are on the desalination plant in Iran has asked the Houthis to do this now. So, which is going to cut off even more oil from flowing out of the Middle East, maybe get it back to that 20%. So you see, again, it's this geographical abnormality, whatever you want to call it, that gives Iran so much leverage. And the location, its ally Yemen is strategically positioned to have this outsized effect on the world economy. And a lot of people might be saying, look, things are more expensive right now. It's an inconvenience. For the United States, it's an inconvenience. For poorer countries, it's already a very bad world economy. But here's the X factor we're not considering. And I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can find this other article. All right, so here's an article titled, "The U.S. Oil Reserve is at a 40-year low, but the government says there's still plenty of breathing room." So a couple of things, and this covers, and I've heard these numbers elsewhere, so I kind of trust them. This is coming from Market Watch. Myra P. Safong. Sorry if I'm butchering that name. So the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, where the United States stores hundreds of millions of barrels of oil, and for the most part uses it as economic intervention to interrupt the price signals from yet one more market, as if healthcare, education, and housing weren't enough. They're also skewing the oil market all the time using this thing, but it holds 714 million barrels in total. Okay. And this article says it's now down to less than half of that at 316.5 million barrels total. And I want to say they said something to the effect of this. This gives the United States, if they kept using it at the rate they're using it, they'd have about 47 days worth of oil. Now, I'm not sure if that means like if they had to depend totally on it, or if that means the drawdowns. I think probably it's if you were depending totally on those barrels of oil. But that's what's kept the price of oil down, is they're releasing oil from this reserve. Now, another thing, they have 316.5 million barrels left. One of the things Larry Johnson said on the Judge Napolitano show several weeks ago was, you can't really look at it like you can't go to zero on this thing. He said that there's a limit below which, if you go, you start to threaten the infrastructure of the container system, the system that contains the oil. And also you can't get the rest out below a certain amount. So I think what he said was it was around 150 million barrels that you can't go past there, or I can't remember why, but things start to happen based on the way the thing's had to be designed in order to hold this much oil. So it's not like you can use all 316 million barrels. There's a certain amount, I think about half, a little less than half of what's left, that you just have to always keep in there, or you're going to destroy the system. So we got that to worry about. So this is the problem. The war for the Iranians, the longer the war goes on, the more leverage they have, because the closer the United States gets to the point where they're going to have to cry uncle. I mean, Iran's not going to cry uncle. Iran views, I think quite correctly, the United States and Israel as threats to their very existence. And probably because the United States and Israel have said many times that they'd like to at least regime change Iran. And of course, Trump has threatened to destroy the entire Iranian civilization, which is, 6,000 years old. So when you feel like you're facing an existential threat, you don't surrender. Okay. It's never happened in history due to a bombing campaign or a blockade, ever. It didn't happen in World War I. It didn't happen in World War II. It didn't happen in Iraq. When we bombed Iraq for 10 years, what finally brought Iraq to its knees? Kind of. I mean, if you consider the first, few months of that at a U.S. victory, they had to send troops in there. They had to send troops in there and defeat the Iraqis on the battlefield And then in order to maintain any control of any part of Iraq, they had to put troops on the ground door to door for 10 years. And they still never had complete control. And then they left. Same thing in this Afghanistan. The history is very clear that what the United States has done so far was never going to get the Iranians to surrender, which is why that memorandum of understanding was so one-sided. It was basically all Iran's demands from the beginning of the war and none of the US's demands at all. That was the memorandum. And I don't know what the intention there was. Obviously, the US is not following it and trying to blame Iran for not following it. Now, Iran did fire on some ships that tried to cross. The US went in there and tried to set up a channel closer to the Oman border coast. And that was against the memorandum of understanding, which Article 5 clearly states that Iran has control of it and that they will later negotiate with Oman for some kind of joint deal. But it doesn't mention the US setting up a channel, okay, to go through there. So when Iran looks at it like, you violated Article 5, we're firing on those ships. And then, of course, the US said, you're violating, I think it's Article 5, or whichever one says Iran will make sure that the strait's clear and also that no one will be charged for 60 days. Like, more language that makes it clear that Iran will be charging people after 60 days and will have control of the strait. So, again, you see Pete Hegseth out there, excuse me, and he's talking about, how many targets the US military hits and how much devastation they cause. And all that's true. Or, well, it's probably mostly true. Let's just say it is true. But the key point is, nothing the US has done so far has been able to prevent the Iranians from closing down the strait, because they're still doing it. Here we are in July. They're still doing it. So if the 40-day bombing campaign didn't, result in Iran no longer being able to shut down the strait, and then however many week, I think it was April through June, so that would be almost 3 months, 88 days, whatever it was, 90 days. If 90 days of blockading did not force the Iranians to surrender, then putting the blockade back on and doing more bombing, I don't understand. Like, what could they be thinking? Now, again, in Trump's view, or at least what he's telling the public, is that, well, now we're going to start hitting infrastructure. It's going to hurt a lot more. Okay, but as we saw, Iran's going to start hitting that same infrastructure in the Gulf states, and it's going to hurt them much worse. Okay, so I mean, this, again, time is on Iran's side. The longer this goes on, the closer we get to an economic cliff where, we have a major problem. I gave you the numbers on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and with that wrinkle that Larry Johnson pointed out, it's like Social Security, right? They told us 2050 it might run out of money, and now it's going to be out of money next year or the year after, right? So it might be a little more of the same. The oil problem might be sooner than what they're implying by giving you the numbers they're giving you. Whatever it is, it's this year, it's this summer probably, or early fall. So time is on the Iranian side. They're facing an existential threat. We are not. Okay, well, another factor here is the United States has seriously depleted its munitions to the point where people in the military are saying, if we had to fight a war right now with China, we don't have enough to do it, to just fight the war. That's how stupid this Iran war is. I mean, you're sitting here whacking a mole in the middle of the desert for a country that poses no threat whatsoever to the United States. Even if they get a nuclear weapon, they pose no threat to the United States. Okay, yeah, this whole wringing the hands over the nuclear weapon is another like kind of, it's almost like a MacGuffin in a movie, right? It's, everyone just takes it for granted. Oh my God, they were going to have a nuclear weapon in 11 weeks or whatever it was. Okay, then they have their nuclear weapon. Now what? They can't fire it at the United States. Could they fire it at Israel? Maybe. And Israel has 200 to 300 of their own nuclear weapons. What happens next? And then the only answer I ever hear to that is, oh, well, they're not rational. They're crazy, 7th century nut jobs. Well, I don't know. They've demonstrated a lot more rationality over the past 4 months than I've seen coming out of Washington, D.C. or Tel Aviv. All right. So whatever their system of government and however they govern their own people, as far as dealing with other countries, they seem far more rational. And this brings us to another thing about the whole thing about them being this fundamentalist theocracy, uber authoritarian, just like Syria, just like every country the DC empire targets, I am skeptical. Is there anything to it? Probably so. Is it as bad as they make it out? Almost certainly not. And I think you saw that demonstrated by the funeral for the old supreme leader, the one they killed the first week of the war. Okay, they have a lot of support. One of the things that you have to realize is that there are many cultures that want authoritarian government, that they've always had authoritarian government. Before the United States was a twinkle in George Washington's eye, these countries existed for thousands of years with authoritarian governments. And it's part of the culture of most countries in the world. This freedom, liberty concept, it's not brand new. I think that's a mistake for people to try and say, oh, this is a brand new thing. Just happened in 1776. No, to some extent, you can see this going back to ancient cultures. But a lot of cultures, that's what they want. They want an authoritarian government. They want order. They don't value personal liberty as highly as they do order. And in Iran, also obedience to religious dictates. See, again, the common people, a lot of women in Iran want to wear the hijab. It's not just because they're being forced. And I've heard them interviewed and talked about what it means to them. You could say they're brainwashed, whatever. Everybody's brainwashed by it in some way. But this idea, of course, that if the United States did this airstrike in late February, early March, and took out some of the Iranian leadership, there would be this big revolution. I mean, we've been hearing that about every country that the United States targets in the world. The only revolutions are the ones the CIA starts. And they did start one in Iran, by the way, and armed like 3,400 people, whom the Iranians eventually killed, after those 3,400 armed insurrectionists killed several hundred Iranian policemen. And from there, we got the number that Iran killed 40,000 peaceful protesters, which is complete bullshit. I'm ready to say that at this point. Of course, you can't believe everything Iran is saying either. They're a government, right? They have propaganda, but I'm pretty sure that the 40,000 number is bullshit. Just the sheer number of people. It's and then they show you 24 body bags. They see, look. So yeah, I think who knows? Something has to give here. The U.S. is not going to win the waiting game. Okay. Iran is just saying, we're not interested in talking anymore. We're done talking. They've said that a lot, and they really haven't talked a lot. I mean, that whole memorandum, as far as I can tell, was worked out with go-betweens, like literally U.S. emails, Pakistan emails, Iran emails, Pakistan emails, United States. as far as I can tell. Now, they may have been talking to somebody in Iran, but they certainly weren't talking to the leadership. And the longer this goes on, Iran is going to drive a harder bargain. Like, I don't think they'll recommit to that memorandum now. It'll have to be more one-sided. And one of the things, and this is another thing, it's like the US is always, oh, we got to topple these dictators. And they never think about like who's going to replace them ever. It's like a cartoon, right? Like Charlie Brown with the football. It just, no matter how many times, they never learn. So there's a lot of hardliners in Iran that were pissed off that the Iranian leadership signed the MOU in the first place. Even as one-sided as it was, they were pissed. They said, no, we're winning this war. Don't make any agreement, at least not yet. So now the MOU is gone for all intents and purposes, and that's what they're hearing over there. And it's kind of like in Russia. They want to get rid of Putin, and they don't stop to think, like, Putin is under fire in Russia because he's not fighting the war the way the United States fought the Iraq war, which is bomb the civilians, create millions of refugees. Putin has avoided doing that in Ukraine, and he's taken more losses than he had to because he's tried to preserve infrastructure, at least up until this point or the last few months. The gloves are starting to come off now. But there are people behind Putin. If you got rid of Putin, you're going to get somebody much, much more hardline. And it's the same in Iran. Now, we already got that in Iran because we got the son of Khomeini, who's much more hardline than his father. And then there's people behind this Khomeini that were upset about the MOU. So the empire is just not smart. If it ever was, it isn't anymore. Even from like an imperial perspective, and I've made this point before, I won't belabor it, but the empire's goals and our goals are not necessarily aligned. Okay. Even when the empire is doing well, that doesn't mean we're doing well, because they're doing well at our expense. Okay. Conquering new territory, which the US doesn't do explicitly, that doesn't help us. All right. Good. Trump talking about taking over Greenland. Why? Now we've got 50 or Canada. We got 50 million more leftists to take care of with their huge welfare state and their government health care, which they'll want when they come here. So, that doesn't help us. It helps the empire because they can extract more taxes, right? At the very least, and control more of the world economy. But what would benefit the United States, the citizens here, is if we got rid of the empire, if we brought our 200,000 troops overseas home and stopped doing all this crap and just walked away from Iran. We'd be better off if we never fought Iraq. We'd be better off if we never fought any war in my lifetime. And I was born in 65. Okay? None of the wars that we fought have benefited the citizens. So, yeah. But even, I guess the point I was getting to is that even if you think like it's good for the empire to do well, like the decisions they've made in this century haven't even been good for the empire. Like the whole Iraq thing was just the dumbest thing ever that they've ever done. Dumber than Vietnam. Let's see. I don't know. The Vietnam, that was the Cold War. Now we found out that the Russians were far more afraid of the West than the West should have been of the Russians after they fell. And of course, we found out they were somewhat a paper tiger, a nuclear power, but as far as any kind of a threat to the West. And so the Vietnam War was supposedly fought because if the North Vietnamese took over South Vietnam and made the whole country a communist country, then there would be a domino effect across East Asia and eventually, causing this domino effect in other parts of the world. So, I mean, here's the thing. North Vietnam did take over South Vietnam. They did become communist, ostensibly for about 12 years before they cried uncle from how bad communism is and started to move toward being a market economy. So that whole war could have never been fought. 14 years, and I think it was 58,000 American lives, and who knows how many millions of Vietnamese they killed for nothing. It didn't do it. At the end of the day, the thing happened, and not only did the whole world not go communist, but literally like 5 years later, China started being not communist anymore. I mean, they call themselves the Communist Party politically, but starting in 79, 5 years after the supposed domino effect would start to happen, the biggest communist country in the world decided to start becoming capitalist. That's how wrong the empire was even back then. So maybe it isn't getting dumber. Maybe it always was dumb. But certainly in this century, it's been very dumb. And then 20 years, to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. There's another one. Now, the only thing you could say, and I want to be careful about this, they've managed not to get as many soldiers killed. So they got 58,000 killed in Vietnam. The total casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan combined are somewhere between 6 and 8,000, which is a lot. I mean, if it's your brother or your son or your father, who cares how many it was? But it's a lot less than 58,000. So they managed to be dumb and get a lot less Americans killed. Of course, they caused all this devastation to civilians in these countries, and it didn't do us a bit of good. I think that's the part I have to get across. None of these wars ever have made our lives better. We're not freer because we fought them. These freaking country songs with, lionizing the war fighters for making us free. I mean, I'm sorry. It's bullshit. Freedom of speech was not at issue in Vietnam. In fact, once they got out of Vietnam, America became freer after they lost the war. All right. We did not become freer for fighting the Iraq War. We became less free. That's when they started snooping into our bank accounts and our emails and vacuuming up all of our web searches and spying on us. And none of this has made us freer. We have become a garrison police state, and Americans are just sleepwalking through it and thanking the troops for the freedom that they don't have anymore. It's just, I don't know. I don't understand how people can be that dense, that separated from reality. So we'll see. We'll see what's happening. I don't know. What's this, July 20th, right? Let's see what's happening in a couple of weeks. I mean, the oil situation will be worse. I don't see where there's going to be a breakthrough. The United States can't afford to do what it did the first 40 days of the war because they don't have enough munitions left. They really shouldn't be using any more at all on this dumb war. Okay, they should be concentrating on replenishing their war supplies in case we ever had to fight a real war. That could happen. It's not very likely right now, but it could happen where the United States would actually have to fight a defensive war that wasn't a war of choice, that wasn't monumentally stupid. And right now, it's questionable whether we would have the ability to do it because we're whacking moles in the desert in Iran. So not smart, certainly not what Trump was elected for. Scott Horton's rule of elections is all the good promises will be broken, all the bad ones will be kept. And of course, Trump's broken about the only good promise he made as far as I was concerned. I mean, I think the tariffs were a bad promise. Of course, those were kept. And immigration, like I said, he did the remain in Mexico. I think that's a good policy. I think it works. And I think that's the bulk of the immigration problem. It's not people jumping a fence. It's people coming here claiming they're refugees and then never showing up for their hearings. Now they got to wait in Mexico. I mean, once he's out of office, they might reverse that again. That's the problem with executive orders instead of Congress, is that no one has to vote. So Biden removed that immediately. That's why all those immigrants were able to flood in. And when we get a Democratic president in 2029, I can't see why that won't happen again, but we'll see. It's a long way off. But anyway, as far as all the good promises are broken, yeah, the one good promise, not to start any new wars, and especially the dumbest one in the Middle East, the dumbest one, really dumber than Ukraine. And Ukraine was dumb. But Trump didn't start that one. He helped start it. So did Obama. But what really started it was Biden green lighting Zelensky bombing civilian neighborhoods in the Donbass. I mean, that's what snapped Putin and made him go into this. So, even dumber was this Iran thing. It's going to have much more negative consequences, as negative as Ukraine has had. And those consequences are not far away, and it's not going to be pretty. So we'll see. Anyway, again, as I always say, if you have not already subscribed, and based on how many audio downloads I get and how many subscribers I have, I would say most of you listening have not subscribed. Please do. It helps. The more subscribers you have, I don't know how it works, but some algorithm or something, you'll be exposed to more new people. And that's what we want to do. We want to be exposed to people who aren't already listeners and already agree with me and that kind of thing. And, more new people will hear the show. Also, my book, It's the Fed Stupid, is free. If you go to itsthefedstupid.com, you'll be invited to join my email list and get even more free content from my emails. And then you get to download this book for free on the Federal Reserve, which has been behaving itself for the last couple years. It has not grown the money supply. I mean, it doubled it in 2020, 21, and then it took about half of that back. And it's been standing pat. It's inching up a little, but it really hasn't been printing a lot of money. So I expect it will when the next crisis hits. But get that book. You can read, if you're not all that familiar with how the Fed works, and, this has my writing about the Fed going back to 2008 and then all the way up to a few years ago. And maybe I'll update it soon, an amended version with some of my more recent writings. But get on my email list and check out my Substack. There's a link to it in the show notes page, another place you can get more content. And we'll see you real soon at Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.